Welcome to the Sugar Freedom Show. I'm your host, Katherine Gordon. Today's episode is How I Manage Reward Deficiency Syndrome. I want to refer you to an article in Frontiers in Psychology. It's called Dopamine and Glucose, Obesity, and Reward Deficiency Syndrome. You can Google that, Dopamine and Glucose, Obesity, and Reward Deficiency Syndrome. And I will also put a link in the notes and then also on my YouTube channel. And also I will post this on my website, which is katherinetraining.com, so you'll be able to find that link. Here's the good news. We are gathering more evidence on how glucose and sucrose affect the reward centers in the brain. So why does this matter to people who are choosing to eat a low sugar, ketogenic, or even a carnivore diet? These studies help explain why eating plans that are low in exogenous glucose make us feel so good. Now, when I say exogenous glucose, I'm talking about the glucose that we get from the food that we eat, as opposed to the glucose that we make through gluconeogenesis in the liver. Now, my glucose tolerance became dysregulated in early childhood. My symptoms were eczema, sugar and carbohydrate cravings, and early periodontal disease. But the worst part of my glucose-driven behaviors was the way sugar and starch became the most important source of pleasure and happiness in my life. In other words, I was suffering from reward deficiency syndrome. I remember the way I behaved before my hunger became severe. I specifically remember being unwilling as a child to stop playing in order to start eating. I loved being outdoors playing on the swings or in the sandbox or under a tree in our backyard. And on rainy days, I didn't want to leave my dolls or my drawing in order to go have lunch or dinner. Food was just not that important in my life. The pleasures of everyday living, like drawing and playing with dolls or playing outside, were more important than food. So what changed? My mother's doctor told her replace our eggs with cereal. This was right around the time when the studies were coming out from Ansel Keys saying that saturated fat and cholesterol were the causes of heart disease. And so doctors started to say, let's take those eggs out of the diet and replace them with cereals and more grains and more foods like that. I specifically remember that I could not get satisfied on the foods that got replaced. For example, I couldn't get satisfied on cereal or Kentucky Fried Chicken or pizza. I was just a little kid, but I knew that something was very wrong with my insatiable hunger. Talk about ruining your appetite. But what was going on? I believe I had two problems with dopamine and reward deficiency syndrome. I most likely have an anomaly in the A1 allele of the D2 dopamine receptor that increases my drive to seek food. And once I start to eat and overeat sugar and starch, that habit makes my dopamine sensitivity even worse. We've recently discovered that there are hunter-gatherer tribes and there are still populations here on the planet that still follow a hunter-gatherer lifestyle, that very often they have this change in the A1 allele on the dopamine D2 receptor that causes more powerful food-seeking behaviors, which would make perfect sense for populations that are hunter-gatherers. Also, I believe, and I've started to study this a little bit, that there may be epigenetic changes that are a result of being from a population that has experienced starvation. My grandfather's people came from Ireland, and they came over from Ireland to the United States during the Great Blight, during the Great Irish Famine. And I believe that there may have been epigenetic stresses and epigenetic changes from that population that still affect people today in terms of how we react to food abundance. In other words, it may be that my heritage of hunger may make me more susceptible to overeating sweets and starches as a self-preservation technique. So to put it simply, I believe that I have inherited traits that make me susceptible to overeating sugar and starch. And then also, I believe that there are environmental changes. In other words, processed foods of today are inexpensive, they're readily available. So it's a combination of inheritance and environment that made me more susceptible to reward deficiency syndrome. Now I'd like to turn to my low glucose diet and how that makes me feel better and how it might make you feel better as well. Number 1, the excess food drive is extinguished by my consumption of adequate protein and fat. And number 2, my dopamine receptors are available to receive the milder stimulus of the pleasures of everyday life. Simple meals, completion of chores, taking care of our hens, piano practice, playing with the dogs, all of these activities and more take up their proper place in my life again. Once I take the overstimulating foods out of my life and I stop that food-seeking behavior, then these regularly enjoyable activities get to take their place in my life, and that makes me happier and healthier. So on top of that, I have energy, no physical pain, no sugar hangovers, and so much less guilt over bad behavior. So the near elimination of almost all eaten glucose from my diet has been the biggest win-win I have ever experienced. And this opened the door to health, happiness, and being at peace with food. So of course, I will post the link to that article in the description. Please glance, skim over, or read it carefully. It is so good to know that evidence is growing for the validity of reducing sugar and carbohydrates in the diet to the point where you feel less craving and more happiness. So until next time, remember, be well and eat for yourself, and come back and listen to The Sugar Freedom Show. Bye-bye, everybody.